Good morning, Oliver. This is your grandma. And your mom told me that you were interested in my book. And so I'm going to record a little bit of it. And you, if you want to hear more, all you have to do is tell me and I'll record more. For the time being, I'm going to record maybe about 15 minutes. And I'll set myself a timer here. You can let me know what you think. I wrote this book some time ago and I was never able to get it published. And although not a lot of people read it, I used it in my teaching. And I think it was the method was very successful. So we'll see if you think so or interested at all. I'm going to start with an introduction called an overview of the book. I named the book Language is a Dance. Many Americans cherish the dream of fluency in a second language, but believe that it is impossible because they are too old or don't have the gift of language learning. They base this opinion on their own unsuccessful attempts to learn language in school. These people are often sad and regretful. They want a better experience for their children, but they don't know how it can be achieved. I believe that the problem is not the age of the learner, as many linguists assert, nor the innate linguistic gifts of the learner, but the way in which the language is taught. The problem is the overwhelming trend in language teaching, which is to treat language as a grammatical code to be deciphered and not an oral environment in which to immerse the learner. Language is a Dance is a book which responds to this problem. It presents language primarily as an oral experience, which is learned by participation. The aspects of language which are most often ignored in language classrooms, the intonation, rhythm, and gesture, are treated as basic and essential to speech. I make a case that although they are not as specific in their meaning as words, these nonverbal elements are essential to fluency. Language must be experienced in order to be learned. Grammar is not the essence of language. Rather, it is a reductive analysis of the way language is used. It is a shortcut to learning the patterns of speech, not an end in itself. Grammar is fluid and changes according to the situation in which it is used. It is an aid to language learning, but the true focus should be on oral speech. This kind of language learning empowers all learners. Those who felt that language learning was not possible for them can enter the dance. And this kind of learning is exciting and exhilarating. The classroom becomes focused on dynamic and energetic learning. This book is divided into two parts. The first part lays the foundation for pedagogy by refocusing attention on oral communication. I try to show that human language, as distinct from animal communication, is a function of the human body. Whales communicate through sound waves transmitted under water. Honeybees use their bodies effectively because they have no voice. Humans use the capacities of acoustic and visual space, the human vocal apparatus, and the two hemispheres of the human brain to create human language. Human language exists on several channels. Sign language is fully gestural. Written language is stripped of sound and gesture, but most human language exists between these two poles. In this section, I show how focusing primarily on grammar ignores the essential human nature of language. I discuss how the complexity of language requires humans to use both hemispheres of their brain in complementary ways. Language is a dance in which complementary partners combine fluid creative movements to produce the phenomenon we know as language. The second part of the book looks at how humans learn language. I begin with the language of infants and children and continue by looking at bilingual communities to demonstrate the principle that all humans are capable of learning a first and second language. I go on to discuss ways in which humans have learned language in the past and why immersing them in oral language is a better way of learning fluency in a second language. I explain how writing sends language learners down the wrong path by convincing them that writing and grammar convey the essence of language. Finally, I discuss the ways in which reading and writing a first language are also enhanced by thinking of language as a dance in which the oral nature of language is primary. The conclusion of Language as a Dance pulls all of these elements together to argue that successful language learning happens best in an oral, fluency-oriented classroom. In a final appendix, I outline the successful program which I developed at the Waring School. I give practical suggestions for educators who wish to implement such a program, either in a public or private school setting. Language as a Dance is a comprehensive argument for fluency-oriented classrooms. I believe that the teacher and student are empowered and rewarded by this type of learning environment. Such an approach is an answer to discouraged language learners who feel they are too old or lack an ear for language. It gives a dynamic pedagogy which can work for beginners at every level of language teaching. It shows that by thinking differently about learning a second language, about learning a second language is as possible as a first. Students can embark upon that learning whenever they decide they need it. Second language fluency in our schools and universities can be a reality, not just a pale dream. The chapter 1 is called Language is 3D. Hoping to flee the excesses of the French Revolution, Monsieur Dufif arrived in the United States in July 1793. His noble parentage and royalist leanings put him in grave danger in France. Ironically, he set out for a democratic stronghold, for he believed that the United States would offer friendship and protection even to a royalist. When he arrived, he headed for Philadelphia, but was waylaid in Princeton, New Jersey. It seems that yellow fever had just broken out in Philadelphia, which was then the capital city, and no one was allowed to enter. Since he spoke no English, Monsieur Dufif began to look for a grammar book to help him learn to communicate in this foreign land. At that time, Princeton was something of a backwater with very few resources to help Monsieur Dufif learn English. He was surprised to find that, at least in Princeton, there were grammar books for Americans who wanted to learn French, but not for Frenchmen who wanted to learn English. Nevertheless, this all turned out well for him because he was forced to pick up English by listening to those around him, with a little help from his dictionary. In 4 months, he had learned a useful amount of English. This experience was so successful that it inspired him to write a textbook, which appeared in at least 5 editions and was used well into the 19th century. The title page explains that it is the, quote, development of the author's plan of tuition, differing entirely from every other so powerful in its operation and so very economical, that a liberal education can be afforded even to the poorest of mankind, by which is obtained the great desideratum of enabling nations to arrive at the highest degree of mental perfection. Monsieur Dufif had discovered that immersion in a new language was faster, easier, more agreeable a method than the grammar-oriented courses he had been raised on. It came as a happy surprise to him that he could learn English so effectively in such a short period of time. Many immigrants to the United States have had similar experiences. They have arrived in a new country, speaking very little, sometimes no English at all, and as they negotiate life in their new homeland, they come to speak and understand this new language with varying degrees of success. John Locke observed the difference between a grammar-oriented method and a method based on conversation and speech. In the 18th century, he wrote, "When I consider what ado is made about a little Latin and Greek, how many years are spent in it, and what a noise and business it makes to no purpose, as if a language or two were the whole business, how else is it possible that a child should be chained to the oar 7, 8, or 10 of the best years of his life to get a language or two, which I think might be had at a great deal cheaper rate of pains and time, and be learned almost in playing. He goes on to propose what he considers a better method than the current pedagogy practiced. As soon as he can speak English, it is time for him to learn some other language. This nobody doubts when French is proposed. And the reason is because people are accustomed to the right way of teaching that language, which is by talking it into children in constant conversation and not by grammatical rules. When he can speak and read French well, which in this method is usually in a year or two, he should proceed to Latin, which it is a wonder parents, when they've had the experiment in French, should not think ought to be learned the same way, by talking and reading. Locke states the problem well, a problem which persists today. If we want to learn a second language, when should this process begin? And should we approach the task by teaching grammatical forms or by using primarily conversation to impart the meaning of the language? Surprisingly, these choices have not changed significantly since the 18th century. I agree with both Monsieur Dufif and John Locke that immersion is the best and most effective way to learn a new language. The problem is that immersion is rarely used in school, where most language learning takes place. The language teaching takes place. The school paradigm is closer to John Locke's chain to the oar metaphor. Those who learn by immersion are usually people who learn on their own. I would like to offer an immersion model that could exist in a school setting. I'd like to bring Monsieur Locke's vision of enjoyable learning to school. But before I offer a model for school learning, I believe that schools and teachers need a solid foundation of theory to understand how to make immersion work in the classroom. If teachers are to embark upon an unknown path, they should have some sense of the route they will take. Before I give an outline of how to develop immersion classrooms, I want to develop a three-dimensional outlook on language itself. When thinking about language, we usually assume that the words on the page are its essence. And yet speakers usually include nonverbal elements in their speech. Gesture, stress, rhythm, and intonation all accompany speech. It is hard to decide what these features bring to language, however. Do they convey information? Do they send grammatical signals? Do they have an important purpose? Or are they merely decorative? We communicate regularly without such nonverbal elements. Words on the page are effective communicators. Speech over the telephone works. But language can communicate in a fragmentary state. Even when words are omitted or unintelligible, language carries meaning. Listeners ignore some speech errors and stumble on others. Is language fragmentary when it omits its nonverbal elements? Is it sometimes like a conversation in which a few words are slurred? Or are missing words different from missing gestures? In what sense are nonverbal elements of human speech part of language? In what ways do language parts other than words comprise the whole? Some aspects of language are like music: its pitch or tone, its stress, its rhythm, its intonation, its pauses. The rhythms of language are recognizable and linked to the particular language we speak. Each speaker stresses and accents words in a rhythmic way. Each language unfolds in time with a recognizable rhythmic form. As listeners recall the words of a familiar song, they speak them rhythmically to the beat of a familiar tune. The musical melody is the natural background for a well-known spoken text. Prove this to yourself by reciting, "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Mom, happy birthday to you." How many syllables did you use to pronounce mom? Language lives in our minds against the backdrop of its rhythm and melody. It is difficult to speak it without supplying this tune. Spoken language can't exist without rhythm. Even when we aren't reciting well-known verses, the tune with which we speak is rhythmic. This metrical property of language is the result of language occurring in time. It allows us to make language poetic and musical. In parts of Africa, drummers communicate messages over long distances merely by using drums. If the hearer is a fluent speaker, he can interpret messages sent by the rhythm of drums. Because audio signals carry the sounds of speech, pitch is an essential part of language. Speakers produce words in a range of audio frequencies. Perception of different pitches is the experience of hearing a range of frequencies. Each speaker has a set of pitches. Men use a range of lower frequencies, and women and children speak in higher frequencies. Rising and falling pitch create an intonational contour typical of spoken language. Finally, speech varies in the way it stresses and accents various elements. Speakers use stress and pauses to highlight meaning. Pauses focus attention on the speaker's meaning. Some words are drawn out, others are clipped and shortened. The speaker's meaning shapes and molds the rhythm and pitch. Additionally, speakers need to pause for the very practical reason that they have to breathe. Linguists call these three melodic aspects of language rhythm, intonation, and prosody. Prosody is highly variable and seems to defy strict classification. Individual speakers choose different intonation contours to speak their sentences and ask their questions. Their prosody seems to be independent of their words or their grammar. Instead of propositional meaning, speakers seem to express attitudes and feelings with intonation. Attitudes and feelings seem to be outside the realm of language. They are more about psychology than propositional truth. Prosody varies depending on the context and the situation. The speaker controls prosody and uses it to influence the way he communicates. Whether in a formal speech or conversation at the bar on Friday night, speakers change their linguistic tunes, just as they vary their structure and vocabulary. Speech lacking prosodic features is often hard to understand. It is monotonic and unstressed. Such speech frequently allows listeners to disengage, letting their minds wander or even fall asleep. Speech that is rich in prosody is interesting and easily draws the listeners into the speaker's world. Thus, prosody, though it is not written on any page, is intimately woven into our speech. It influences the emotional messages we send to our listeners. It communicates our attitudes. It is elusive and hard to analyze, and its rules are fluid and complex. Can we call it language? Is it paralinguistic? Should we strip it away to reveal pure language? However we classify prosody, we cannot understand language fully without understanding its place in speech. Stop here.